Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Forbes senior contributor, Howard Gleckman. Howard, I appreciate you coming on today.
Good to be with you.
Lawmakers are currently in a stalemate over the debt limit, and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said this week that the U.S. government could run out of money to pay its bills as soon as June 1st. So first, I want you to break down the seriousness of this moment. What are the implications here if the U.S. defaults on its financial obligations?
Well, it's hard to imagine how bad it would be, but it would be pretty substantial. We are already in a period of rising interest rates. We're in a period of the economy beginning to slow because of the Fed's action to raise interest rates. If the government defaults on its debt, it will just accelerate those trends. Interest rates will rise even faster. The economy will grow even more slowly, or maybe even fall into recession. The consequences for consumers and for business people would be catastrophic.
Let's break that down even further. Alarm bells obviously have been ringing over the debt limit over the past few months, but they really came to a blaring ring once Janet Yellen said that the U.S. could run out of money as soon as June 1st, just this week. So, how would this specifically impact the everyday American?
As I say, interest rates are going to go up. Interest rates are already rising. They're going to rise even faster than they are. That means credit card debt is going to get more expensive. It's going to get harder to buy a house. It's going to be harder to buy a car. And this will affect business. Remember, one of the other things that's happening in the background here are these bank failures, which is already making banks more reluctant to make commercial loans. In that environment, if interest rates are rising very fast, banks will be even more reluctant to make loans. If businesses can't get loans for cash flow, for example, they may have to lay off workers. So the consequences, both for consumers and for workers, could be pretty serious.
Howard, you wrote about this for Forbes, and I want to read you a passage that really stuck out to me. Congress is stumbling towards its usual off ramp, finding a way to continue borrowing while avoiding the hard choices needed to reduce deficits and slow the growth of the ever increasing debt. What are the choices that you think need to be dealt with?
So the Congress is facing two separate issues. One of them is the short-term debt limit problem, which it has to confront. It can't ignore that. The other problem is the budget deficit. And Republicans are exactly right when they say that the budget deficit is too big. We have massive amounts of debt, and as interest rates are rising, that debt is going to cost the government and taxpayers more money. So we do need eventually to deal with it. The problem is that it's pretty clear that Congress doesn't really want to act to do what it needs to do to reduce the deficit. Democrats don't want to reduce spending. Republicans talked bravely earlier about reducing spending, but as time goes on, they keep deleting the categories of spending that they're willing to address. So they started off talking about doing something about Medicare and Medicaid now and Social Security. Now they've pretty much dropped the Medicare and Social Security initiatives. They say they won't do anything about defense spending. Most of them say they won't do anything about veterans benefits. And by the time you're done jettisoning all the things that you want to protect, you'd have to shut down the entire rest of the government in order to achieve their stated goal of balancing the budget in 10 years. So Republicans are getting cold feet about spending. And Republicans, of course, are never going to favor tax increases. So if we're not going to raise taxes and we're not going to reduce spending very much, we're not going to accomplish very much in terms of the budget deficit.
I want to talk about where we are specifically as you and I are sitting here when it comes to debt limit negotiations. So let's talk about the major players. Let's start with the House GOP. So House Speaker Kevin McCarthy really notched a legislative win last week in passing the Limit Save Grow Act. Can you break down the House GOP's plan?
So the plan is less of a plan than a bargaining chip. It leaves a lot out. In general, what it says is it would return government spending for what are called discretionary programs. That's everything except for programs like Medicare and Social Security. It would return those programs to what they were a couple of years ago, and then increase them only by 1% a year, which of course is much lower than the rate of growth of the economy or the rate of growth of inflation. uh, that would result in a significant result in spending, in domestic spend, result in significant decline in domestic spending. Uh, Not enough to achieve their balanced budget goal. The problem with it is it leaves a lot out. So we don't know from this proposal, even though it's 320 pages long, exactly what spending on the domestic side they would cut. For example, what would they do about veterans benefits? Sometimes they say they would cut it, sometimes they say they won't. The document doesn't really explain that. So there's a lot unanswered there. The other thing the bill would do is it would extend the debt limit, allow the government to continue to borrow until probably next spring, about a year from now. The problem with that, of course, is that that would put us in another debt limit fight right in the middle of the 2024 presidential campaign, which is about the worst possible time I could imagine to have a discussion like that. So the bill is a bargaining chip. It gives the Republicans some place to start when they start discussing this with the president. The congressional leadership and President Biden are supposed to meet next week at the White House to begin to discuss this.
It's interesting. You call this a bargaining chip, which it is, but Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer called it dead on arrival when it gets to the Senate. And he, along with President Joe Biden, said they would only agree to raise the debt ceiling without any other conditions. Are Democrats being realistic here?
Well, actually, I think the Democrats still have the upper hand here. Um, uh, because Janet Yellen said that we're going to have to confront this debt limit thing in less than a month. It's impossible for Congress to do a budget in a month. Never in history have they been able to do that. They're not going to do it now. So that means, in effect, that Congress is not going to be able to achieve what Republicans say. They're not going to be able to agree on spending reductions. It's also interesting, you talked about where Biden is and where Schumer is. You didn't mention the other important player here, who's Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell. And Mitch McConnell has been very interesting about this because he has said for months he's not willing to allow the government to default on its debt, which kind of cuts the pins out from under what House Republicans are trying to do. He's also said, don't ask me to get in the middle of this negotiation between the president and the House Republicans. That's not my problem, it's their problem. So Republicans are not exactly in lockstep on this either. Um, it wouldn't surprise me, frankly, at this point, if they don't agree to extend the debt limit for some months to give themselves more time to negotiate some of the other issues. Remember that when Congress does a budget, it's a clumsy, long, slow, awkward process. But essentially, what happens is the committees, the House and Senate Appropriations Committees, sit down and they agree, agency by agency, on how they're going to spend money. That process is going to have to go forward at some point over the next several months. So one could imagine, for example, delaying all of this debt limit stuff until, let's say, next September 30th, when we're going to have another crisis over whether the government's going to shut down because Congress hasn't done a budget, and rolling all that together into one big package of some sort. So that's a possibility. Biden has to save face because he has to say we're going to do the debt limit separately from the spending bills. But if everything moves on two separate tracks, it could all get put together in 6 months.
I want to talk about potential outcomes, but first, you obviously mentioned a really important player in this, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. And I want to know how he can say two things at once. One, we will not default on our debt. But two, hey, don't involve me. This is between McCarthy and Biden. How can he play? It seems like he's playing both sides here.
He is. And remember, Senator McConnell has got his own issues. He has got some of his caucus, people like Ted Cruz, who probably would be very happy to see a default. They've sort of taken us to the edge of the cliff before. But then he has other members of his caucus who are, I suspect, very concerned about this and probably would be willing to vote with Democrats to extend the debt limit, even if there's no big, cosmic budget deal. So McConnell has got to navigate his own caucus, which is going to be a real challenge for him. And there's no reason for him to get in the middle of this pretty antagonistic debate between Biden and McCarthy.
And just this week, President Biden invited top congressional leaders, including Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, Hakeem Jeffries, as well as Speaker Kevin McCarthy, to the White House on May 9th. So I'm sure details will come out of that. But the Problem Solvers Caucus is a bipartisan group of about 60 House representatives. What's the solution they're proposing?
So the problem solvers want to extend the debt limit for a couple of years, um, and they want to have a commission to consider the budget deficit and the debt. Uh, this is not the first commission that I've seen. Uh, every time Congress doesn't want to deal with a problem, it creates a commission. And what the problem solvers people are doing is they're trying to fix one problem, which is the debt limit, but they're not actually doing anything to fix the second problem, which is the debt. So this is a fig leaf. This is kind of another off ramp. It's another way to get past the debt limit problem, but it won't do very much at all to solve the long term problems of the deficit and the debt.
The solutions that you're saying, it sounds like it's not solving the root cause. It's just kind of kicking the can down the road and a temporary fix to a long-term problem. And you wrote this for Forbes. You laid it out pretty straightforward. There is no secret to reducing the deficit. Lawmakers already know how. They just don't want to. How could lawmakers reduce the deficit, and why don't they want this course of action?
So remember that when you get elected to Congress, you're elected to do things. Even hardcore conservatives are elected to do things, or different things than progressive Democrats will do. But you're elected to do things. You're elected to accomplish something. Uh, Cutting spending makes a small group of hardcore fiscal conservative Republicans happy, but it doesn't really make anybody else happy. You think about where you're going to cut spending. Even if you're a conservative Republican, are you going to cut spending for border security? That's a very important issue to a lot of your constituents. Are you going to cut farm subsidies? That's a very important issue for another set of your constituents. If you're a Democrat in Congress, are you going to cut food stamps? Are you going to cut Medicaid? That's very important to your constituents. So what happens is lawmakers look at actual spending cuts, and they can never agree on what to do. When it comes to taxes, they're even farther apart. Democrats basically say tax increases are a big part of the solution to this problem. And Republicans, for the most part, say tax increases are absolutely off the table. We'll never agree to them under any circumstances. In fact, what we want to do is we want to cut taxes. So they're nowhere. They can't reach any sort of a consensus on what to do. It's a symptom of all of the partisanship that we face in every other issue, whether it's immigration or crime or anything else. But this is one that's been out there for decades, and we simply don't want to address it because politicians don't want to get their constituents mad at them.
In every conversation that I've had about the debt limit, the same theme comes up. We're at an impasse. And a few dates to look forward to: the May 9th date when President Biden meets with McCarthy. I'm sure news will come out then. Also, June 1st is an important date, and it's coming up. It's really TikTok. We have a very short amount of time to fix this problem. So what do you think the potential outcomes are here? Will we stumble off this debt limit cliff? Will lawmakers kick the can down the road? Or do you think there's going to be an actual solution?
So I'm a kick the can down the road guy. I suspect that the result of the meeting next week between the president and the congressional leadership will essentially be a photo op, an agreement to disagree, and maybe at the best possible circumstance is an agreement to put the debt limit extended. Let's put it a different way: to extend the debt limit for a few months until next September, where we will then have this argument all over again. Um, there are a lot of people who say we'll go off the cliff. Frankly, I think we won't. I suspect there are enough members of Congress, including Republicans, who understand the consequences of the federal government defaulting on the debt and who won't let it happen. The question is, how will they do it? There's talk in the House about various, legislative tricks, like what they call a discharge petition, which would bring a vote to the floor over the objections of Kevin McCarthy. That's something that might happen, but probably won't happen until the last possible minute. As I say, in the Senate, the Democrats need 8 Republicans to get to their 60 votes, assuming that all the Democrats support this, to extend the debt limit for a period of time. I suspect there are probably more than 8 Republicans in the Senate who would be willing to vote for a debt limit extension. The problem is, how do you get past the partisanship? Right now, if you're a Republican, your team is against extending the debt limit, and if you're a Democrat, your team is in favor of extending the debt limit. And what you need to do is find some way to get people willing, at least temporarily, to cross over, the red line, and vote with the other team. And that's always hard to do. But I think when you're facing something as catastrophic as breaching the debt limit, it'll happen.
You've said before that as of right now, the Democrats appear to have the upper hand. But right now, we are at the backdrop of the beginning of a presidential election. Politically, do you see any winners and losers emerging? Or do people not really care about that? They just, as long as the debt limit, we don't fall off that fiscal cliff, they don't really care.
Yeah, I think if we resolve the issue, nobody's going to care. They're going to just say, "Oh, it's Washington playing its usual games, and it doesn't really matter. It didn't really affect me any." If we go off the cliff, or if we get close enough, remember that Wall Street could react to this even before the X date, the date that we go over the cliff. So, if say a week or 10 days before June 1st, or whatever the date's going to end up being, the bond markets begin to crash, then we're going to start seeing rising interest rates even before we breach the debt limit. And if that happens, then you may see some more immediate action, and people may actually suffer some real consequences. If that happens, then the question is, as it always is, who are they going to blame? Now, to some degree, they're going to blame everybody. But the question is, who are they going to blame more? It's interesting to me that Republican presidential candidates, including Donald Trump and some of the other hopefuls, have had very little to say about this. They also seem to want to not get in the middle of this mess. So, will Biden be blamed? Will the congressional Republicans be blamed? Will they all be blamed? I think it's going to really depend on what happens over the next month, and whether people feel any real consequences for this, or if this is just considered another kind of Washington comedy.
As we find out what happens over the course of the next few weeks, I hope you come back on and join me and share your insights. Howard Gleckman, thank you for joining me.
Good to be with you. Thank you.